Good afternoon, and welcome to Lunching with Books. It is so good to see all of you here. Just a few announcements. We will be having a book sale November 3rd, so if you need some books that are reasonably priced, please come out. There's always a great selection and a good crowd, so I hope to see you then. Jack, tomorrow there's a book signing, and you have a calendar, right? That's.
Yeah, thank you. Last year, 2018, Pat Powell, who we know some very well, Steven Rabalais, and I came up with the idea of a fundraiser for the Music Bend Nature Trail. I don't know how many of you know about it or walked it, but it's on Veterans Park on the west side and behind the Bart Park. And anyway, Pat spent a year photographing that trail in the different seasons of the year, and we're having a calendar signed. Then I did the commentaries. We're having a 2019 calendar made up from his photographs. It's $15, and all 100% of the proceeds will go to the Friends of the Music Bend to keep that trail maintained and cleared and just keep it in good shape. And that's at the Montgomery Bookstore tomorrow from 11:30 to 1.
So I hope you can go out and purchase a calendar and support the trail, and you may want to hike it. Today our reviewer is Jak Smith, and the book he is reviewing is about Fox Connor, General Fox Connor, that a lot of us don't know that much about, but it is a fascinating book, and it is about a fellow Mississippian. Presently, Jack lives in Geeville. I'm sure you all know where that is, close to Baldwin. And but he was born in Ripley and graduated from Ripley High School, and he attended the United States Military Academy at West Point in New York. And he served in the 11th Armored Cavalry in Germany, and he attended and graduated from Ole Miss Law School in 1975. He was with the Judge Advocate General's Corps in Denver, Colorado for 3 years, and then he moved to Mississippi and to Tupelo in 1978. He's been a practicing attorney here for several years, and of course he's married to Sharon, who is his hiking companion. Of course, Jack's avocations are just as interesting as his vocation, I suppose. Currently, he's the past president of the William Gray chapter of the Sons of the American Revolution, and he is presently the second vice president of the state of the Sons of the American Revolution. He is a member of the Lewis and Clark Heritage Trail Foundation, which I'm sure you've hiked and canoed and yeah. All right. And he's a member of the Mississippi Historical Society. And he and Sharon have backpacked and hiked over 400 miles of the Appalachian Trail. And, of course, he's a mountain climber. In fact, he's really the only one I've ever known. And he has climbed some of the highest mountains in the world, including Mount Rainier, Mount Blanc, Mount Kilimanjaro, Mount Fuji, Mount McKinley, Mount Hood, Pikes Peak, and the list just goes on and on. So anyway, he has had a life filled with adventure. So anyway, welcome, Jack. He's one of our favorite reviewers, and it's good to have you here.
Somebody asked me if I was going to read all this stuff, and Sharon said, well, we'll be here till 5 o'clock. We won't. I'll get through with this pretty quickly. I appreciate that introduction, babe. And I want to say I realize this is a book review, and I have to remember that, but I also want to tell you something about this guy, Fox Connor. Who all in here have heard about Fox Connor, know who he is? I see a few hands up. This is the book, General Fox Connor. And I want to tell you, I've got to tell you some things about him, but there's 3 other very prominent people that are the sum and substance of this book also. George Patton, Everybody's heard of George Patton. Everybody's heard of George C. Marshall, who was the Chief of Staff of the Army. He was during World War II. He was the Secretary of State after World War II, and he's the guy that invented and orchestrated the Marshall Plan that saved Europe after World War II, and probably one of our greatest military civilian figures. And the third guy, who all in here has heard of Dwight D. Eisenhower? Well, I promise you, if you read this book, and it's the best researched history book I probably have ever read. I know the author now. I've never physically met him, but he and I talk on the phone fairly often. I buy books from him over the phone, and he and I have had a lot of discussions. He's a lawyer down in Lafayette, Louisiana. And I'll tell you about my little funny story about lawyers. Everybody has to tell a lawyer joke. It's not really a joke, but I've been spending a lot of my time studying the Battle of Gettysburg. And I was telling somebody the other day that the 3 Mississippi brigades at the Battle of Gettysburg were all commanded by lawyers. And this guy said, no wonder we lost. So, maybe there's some truth to that. But anyway, you would never in your lifetime have ever heard of Dwight D. Eisenhower but for Fox Connor. Now, who was Fox Connor? That begs that question. Fox Connor was born in Slate Springs, Mississippi. Now, if you know where Geeville, Mississippi is, where I live, you might have heard of Slate Springs. I honestly have never heard of Slate Springs until I read this book, but it's in Calhoun County, not far from where we are right now. And I'm going to tell you that this guy, Fox Connor, was the most influential military person in the mid-20th century in this country. If you don't know anything about Fox Connor, I'm going to tell you some things today that will really amaze you. I have given this talk to several groups, and I tell everyone, and I know everybody probably agrees with this, that the state of Mississippi has produced more celebrity football, legal people, athletes, writers, famous people of real quality and character than any state in the Union per capita, and most states, period. But Mississippi, if you think about it, has really, that people are our most important product. I've talked to William Winter about this one time. I said that Napoleon, I'm a student of Napoleon, Napoleon invented the Legion of Honor as a civilian and military award to give to people who had made great contributions. And I said, I wish we could do something like that in Mississippi. Fox Connor would clearly get the Legion of Honor. If he were in France, he would definitely have gotten it several times over, probably. But let me tell you about him. His father was in the Civil War, and he was at Shiloh and fought several battles in the Civil War. And in Atlanta, a bullet cut both through his eyes, and he was blinded the rest of his life. And he moved back down to Calhoun City, or Slate Springs, after the war. His best friend in the war was a guy named Jesse Fox. So he married Jesse Fox's sister after the war and had this boy who he called Fox Connor. That's not a nickname, that's his real name. And he named him after his best friend and his wife's brother. And Fox was always interested in the military, and he would talk to his dad about all these battles he was in and all this. And of course, Slate Springs, Mississippi did not have the highest academic standards maybe in the world at the time. But Fox's dad and mother both, I think, taught. His mother was a teacher. His dad was a very educated man, and so they educated him as best they could. He decided at a fairly early age that he wanted to go to West Point. He had a relative, and I don't know how many people have ever heard of this guy. I hadn't. Hernando de Soto Money. That was his name. Hernando, H.D. Money, M-O-N-E-Y. He was Fox's cousin, uncle, or something. I can't remember. But he was our congressman from North Mississippi. This is, right after the Civil War, Hernando de Soto Money, and obviously Fox got an appointment to West Point. So he goes to West Point. but he can't pass the entrance exam the first year, so they gave him another appointment, and he finally squeaked by. He entered the class. He graduated in 1898 from West Point. He was born in 1874 down in Slate Springs, but he went to West Point and graduated eventually from West Point in the class of 98. And he graduated 17 out of 59, which is, fairly good. They started with 109. By the time they graduated, it was down to 59. But he was one of these persistent students. Women didn't interest him at that time, didn't get into any kind of big trouble, but he just studied. He was an amazing man. He did this all his life. He was a lot like Stonewall Jackson, a lot like Napoleon, in that he was a serious, really serious student of the military. And and you'll hear some of his stuff. He ranked at the bottom part of his class in foreign languages. But by the time he died, he spoke fluent French, fluent German, fluent Spanish. He taught himself all these languages. He was so good, and let me move on, and I'll get to that in a minute. But he graduated in the class of 98. Well, there was something that happened in 1898, and that was the Spanish-American War. So he tried to go there to the Spanish-American War. They sent him to Rhode Island because he was in the artillery. They put him in the artillery, as I like to say, all good officers that are any account were in the artillery. And, of course, I was in the artillery. And Napoleon was in the artillery, and so was Fox Connor. But they send him up there, and then eventually he finagles his way down into Cuba, but the war's already over down there by that time. Didn't take long to settle that in Cuba. His tactical officer at West Point was a guy named John J. Pershing, Black Jack Pershing. And Black Jack Pershing was his tack and at West Point, and apparently he was a hard ass. And they got in all kind of trouble with each other at West Point. He knew him at West Point. Pershing knew Fox Connor, and Fox was all the time playing tricks on his tactical officer, got in trouble, got 382 demerits while he was at West Point, mainly from smoking and being late to everything. So Pershing already knew him. Pershing then right after that time, Fox goes down to Cuba. And the important thing, when he went to Cuba, he didn't really do any fighting or anything like that, but he ran into this girl from New York named, believe it or not, this is not her first name, I think it's Elizabeth is her first name, but everybody called her Bug Brandreth. And she set her sights on this guy to marry him. Her dad was from New York. She grew up in New York, a very wealthy family. He was in the patent medicine business, and her dad had served in the Union Army, and he had told his 3 daughters, I don't want any of you marrying a soldier because it's just going to be too hard a life. Well, here, the first daughter, Bug, falls in love with Fox Connor. Fox was not interested in her initially, but when he got back up to Washington, she made sure that she got down there and they fell in love. And this book is a great love story. And I'm happy to announce, like most books you read, they never got a divorce. They never cheated on each other. They had a wonderful, by all accounts, it was just a wonderful marriage. They had several children. Her dad owned this place up in upstate New York that was 47 square miles of property that he owned up there, not a small place, and they still own it. And Steven Rabalais told me, the author of the book, said, I've been up there too, and I was invited to come up, and several members of the family were there, and I got to meet them. All the children are passed away now, but their children, the grandchildren of Fox and Bug, are there. But they had a great marriage, and this book goes all the way through. They were right hand in glove the whole way through their life. And they had some hard times in the Army. They were assigned, I'll tell you, some places that were pretty rough. But she stuck by him, and he was a very loyal husband the whole way through, and same with her. But anyway, after he graduated from West Point and tried to go down there to Cuba, that didn't work out. So he was assigned to Fort Riley, Kansas, and to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, to spend time in artillery. Fox Connor became the recognized expert in America on artillery and artillery doctrine, and you'll see how that all falls through on this real quickly. And he was assigned to Fort Riley. Well, he got on the train with Bug, and they were heading to Fort Riley, and he looked down at the end of the car, and there was this young lieutenant sitting down there. I guess by this time he was a captain, and there was a young lieutenant down there with a great big sword at the end of the thing, a guy named George Patton. Y'all have heard of George. And so he went and introduced himself, and they became lifelong friends. And the Pattons and the Connors were the two wealthiest officers in the whole United States Army. The Pattons inherited a ton of money, and his wife, Bug's wife, had a ton of money, and they enjoyed their lives together. That money helped them get through some tough places, but the Pattons and the Connors got to be extremely good friends, and then you'll see how this all fits in when World War I comes along. To show you how outstanding Fox Connor was, what a recognized expert he was, he went to the first staff school. They started a staff school, what we would call Command and General Staff, which is a big honor to go to that. Well, they assigned him to this thing. He was only a captain at the time, and he skipped the whole first year of Command and General Staff School because he knew so much information. They said, we're wasting our time. He ended up being an instructor of all these colonels while he was just a captain at the Command and General Staff School. Now that tells you something right there, that this guy's on the ball. He was one of 3 officers to skip that first year, and he ended up instructing the colonels in tactics and all that while he was there. Now, World War I comes along. President Wilson, they got in, what's coming up in about 20 days? What day do we have coming up? The 100th anniversary of Armistice Day. November the 11th, 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month will be the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. This guy, Fox Connor's conduct during World War I was just unbelievable. First of all, Pershing, right before World War I, goes down to Mexico trying to catch Pancho Villa. And Fox did not get to go down there at the time, but he eventually kind of finagled his way down. World War I, and they didn't catch Pancho Villa, but Pershing had some more association with him down there. And in World War I, in 1914, the war started, but we did not get involved till 1917. And it was kind of an interesting story, I thought. General Joffre came over. He was not the... At one time, General Joffre, the French general, had been in charge of all the French army, actually the whole war effort over in Europe. And he came over for a trip when President Wilson announced and went to Congress on April the 2nd, 1917, to ask for articles of war. And it was passed by the Congress and everything, I think, on April the 4th. And right after that, General Joffre came over. Well, Fox Connor was assigned to be his interpreter. He couldn't speak English, so they assigned Fox Connor from Slate Springs, Mississippi, to be General Joffre's interpreter and guide. And they had this big parade for him in New York. And Joffre turned around to Pershing, who was the commander at the time, and said, "Well, now, sir, we need y'all to send a division over to America as soon as you possibly can." We didn't have a division. We were as totally unprepared for World War I as you could get. Now, nowadays, thank goodness, our military, we feel, is very prepared for any eventuality. We had 28,000 people total in the Army at that time. I mean, we were so unprepared, it wasn't even funny. Fox Connor was the guy who organized America's defense. He invented what was called the square division. It was a method of composing an American division. He invented that. He also invented the staff mechanism that is used in the American Army today. Some of you that have been in the military know what G1, G2, G3, G4, these are the different departments. Pershing put him, despite his acting up at West Point when he was a cadet and Pershing was his tactical officer, one night Bug put a bucket of water over a door knowing Pershing was going to come in, and he opened the door and the bucket fell on him full of water. But Pershing had forgiven him by this time. And he made him his chief of staff, his S3 or G3, the head of operations. And then he was promoted to major and then colonel, and by the time World War I was over, he was a brigadier general. But he was the guy, and I forgot to tell you this, in 1911, before the war, he knew French so well, fluent in French, they sent him as the first liaison officer, American officer, to serve with the French Army. He served a year with the French artillery. This was before the war started, but they were still training, and they kind of knew a war might be coming on, and we were sitting over here fat, dumb, and happy, and we didn't make any effort to get ready for a war. We weren't even going to get in the war. But we ended up getting in 1917, but we were totally unprepared. So imagine this is your job. You have got to go over to a country, France, to fight a war, and guess which side you're on? The losing side. We were losing the war at this point. The French had lost 1 million men in that war so far. They had the Communist Revolution in Russia, and Russia had agreed to just get out of the war. That freed 1 million German soldiers to come over to the Western Front. And there had been a mutiny in the French army just before, I think it was in March of 1917. They had lost so many people, and they would get in these, I'm not going to hopefully get down into the mud of the World War I, but this book does. This book really gets into the detail of that. And they talk about the casualties of World War I were just staggering. You can go to France now, or England, and every little town, you won't find a monument. You have to look for a monument to World War II. But you can find every little town in France has a monument to World War I. Every town. And almost, I think, every town in Germany that I've ever been to had a World War I monument. Same thing in England. You go in there. Sharon and I were in Westminster Abbey several years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, and there's monuments in Westminster Abbey to the old Contemptibles for the British Army that fought in the initial stages of World War I. There were so many people that were killed in that war, millions of people. And so we had to get over and organize, and the guy that did it was Fox Connor. He organized this Square American Division. He came up with the entire staff. He had to oversee the training and assembly of millions of totally untrained people. We just didn't have these divisions ready to go over. They were totally unprepared. He had to train them, bring them in. Can you imagine what that job must have been like, trying to bring all these old country boys and people from the cities in, never seen a rifle, some of them, and having to train them to fight the greatest army at the time, the German army and these million more Germans were coming over. So Fox Connor was in charge of that. They had their headquarters at Chaumont behind Verdun, and he ran the war from a little room in that building, and Steven Rabalais told me that he's been over there, and the building's still there. Where they had their headquarters. It's a fairly small building. They ran everything. Fox Connor was the guy that advised Pershing. You may not know this, but the French wanted us, as soon as we got to France, to just start feeding American soldiers into the French army to fill the slots they had with all their casualties, and the British wanted the same thing. Fox Connor advised Pershing, don't do that. We need to fight as an American army. We need to be our own army over here and occupy our own sector and fight it like that. And that was good advice. I mean, that was, you didn't want to just turn over the American army to the French. And so he didn't. And he followed Fox Connor's advice, Pershing did. And we were successful in the war. And he ran the St. Michel offensive, several of these huge offensives. He was the operations officer. He's the guy that was in charge, basically, of World War I and our fighting the whole war. At the end of the war, he wrote the after-action report for our armies. After a war, you have to write an after-action report and tell what happened, when it happened. He was the guy that Pershing had do it. And now, let's get back a minute. During World War I, what do you think of when you think of George Patton? tanks, right? I do. I'll tell you a little vignette. When the movie Patton played, when it first came out, they had the opening of the movie at West Point when I was a cadet. And I walked into the theater. They were having a free showing for all the cadets. And I walked down to the front and sat on the front row with my roommate. I was a regimental executive officer, and he was the regimental commander. And I sat down by him, and I was sitting there, and he said, "Jack, you're not going to believe this, but George C. Scott and Carl Malden are sitting right behind you." And I thought he was pulling my leg. And I turned around, and there was old George C. Scott, just like this. And so he sat behind me at the movie. But you think of tanks. Who appointed George Patton to the Tank Corps? Fox Connor. He was the guy that knew that Patton was a tank man. Fox Connor knew that tanks were going to be the new weapon of war. And so he put the best guy he could find, George Patton, good decision. During World War I, who discovered George C. Marshall? Fox Connor. George C. Marshall was a captain down on somebody's staff from the 1st Division, and he picked him out. He knew people, and he found this guy named Captain George C. Marshall. He brings him over and starts training him to be a staff officer, and turned out to be the greatest staff officer probably that ever lived. And Fox Connor, and I'm going to tell you a real funny story about that. If I hopefully won't forget it. I may just go ahead because I might. I've gotten to that age. One time during World War II, when George C. Marshall was in charge of the American armies, navies, everything, Franklin Roosevelt walked into his office and was talking to him, or not walked, but I guess he came into his office and was talking to George C. Marshall, and he called him George. And George C. Marshall promptly basically locked the president's heels and said, "Mr. President, my first name is General." The only guy, and Franklin Roosevelt never called him George after that. The only guy that could call him George any time before, after World War II, Fox Connor. Any time that he called George Marshall George, "Yes, sir, General." And any time that George C. Marshall, George Patton, or Dwight Eisenhower ever referred to the General, it was Fox Connor. And I'm going to show you what an influence he had on these guys. So he picks Marshall to train him to be a staff officer, which he turned out to be so great. And let's talk about about Eisenhower. After World War I, did Eisenhower get to go to World War I? Negative. During that time, he was a regimental supply officer in like the 19th Division, stuck off somewhere. He did not get to go to World War I. He didn't get to go to the Pancho Villa thing because he was a football coach. He played football at West Point. And back in those days, every little post had football teams. So these officers would put Eisenhower in charge of the football team. And he was going nowhere in his career. At one point after World War I, he had lost his first son. He and Mamie's first son died, and he was being court-martialed. I know probably none of y'all have heard that. Dwight D. Eisenhower was being court-martialed. And several people tried to get him out of it. No. The Inspector General said, "No, we're court-martialing Dwight Eisenhower for misrepresenting a $536 payment that he got from the Army." They're claiming Dwight Eisenhower claimed that he was living off base when in fact he was living on base. And the Army, being pretty tight with money in some cases, decided to prosecute him. Well, Fox Connor got assigned to the Panama Canal Zone. And he said to George Patton one day, "Hey, I need an aide. Do you have any? I got this guy, Dwight Eisenhower. He's my next door neighbor." So he gets Eisenhower, and Eisenhower was fed up with the Army. His career was going nowhere. He was being prosecuted, and he had lost his first son. And he was very disenamored with the Army. Well, if you've ever been in the Army, you know there's movers and there's shakers in the Army that can get things done. Well, Fox Connor told everybody that he was going to pick Eisenhower as his aide. So he goes up to whoever's in charge of this court-martial, and you know what? Just miraculously, No. Who said we're prosecuting him? We're not going to prosecute him, General Connor. I don't know what you're talking about. So they dropped the charges on Eisenhower. Eisenhower takes he and Mamie down to the Panama Canal Zone. And during that time, I want to read this to you real quickly, if I can find it. Eisenhower wrote after World War II in his book, one of his books he wrote, he said, "My tour of duty in Panama with Fox Connor was one of the most interesting and constructive periods of my life and the main reason for my being where I was at the end of the war." The 5-star general. And here's why. If you look at his career, hadn't gone to World War I, hadn't gone to Mexico. He was a football coach. He was in the infantry. He was being prosecuted, lost his son, and Fox Connor takes him to Panama. And in those 3 years, they spent the entire 3 years together. Fox started teaching in the book. You just got to read the book about how, I don't have enough time to tell you right now, how Fox Connor was able to take Dwight D. Eisenhower in a period of 3 years. This guy disenamored with the Army, and in 3 years of constant work, he watched Connor work. He watched him with his troops. He watched him every day. They would get together, read history, and they would do all kind of things together. By the end of that 3 years, he said, "Now, Eisenhower, you need to go to Command and General Staff School." "Well, General, I can't do that. I hadn't even been to my basic course." He said, "Well, look, when you get back, we'll get you in Command and General." So he goes back. Well, what do? Put him back in charge of a football team. And I promise you, he was at Fort Meade, and Connor said, "Listen, Eisenhower, will you do everything I tell you to do?" He said, "General, whatever you tell me to do, I'm going to do." So he says, "I want you to resign from the infantry and get in the Adjutant General's Corps," which was a death knell for a career officer. He said, "General, if you tell me to do it, I'll do it." And he did it. Well, the Adjutant Generals had a slot at Command and General Staff. So Connor, again, the mover and shaker that he was, gets him in there, and the commander of the Command and General Staff School said, "Eisenhower, there's no way you can pass the course. You haven't even been to your basic course." He graduated number 1 out of 275 of the best officers in the Army. And at that point, Connor got him in with Douglas MacArthur, his aide, which didn't hurt your career, usually, to get in with Douglas MacArthur. And who picked Eisenhower to head the American Army in World War II? George C. Marshall. If you look at that strain, you've got this total strain through all those 3 officers of Fox Connor. Marshall became what he was, Patton what he was, and Eisenhower what he was because of Fox Connor. During World War II, right before World War II, he was picked to take over essentially what that job that Marshall had later on. He was going to be the chief of staff of the Army, but his health had deteriorated to the point he did not feel like he could do the job. I'm going to finish up, and I know I'm skipping tons of stuff because this book is, let me say this, Steven Rabalais is not sitting here. It is the best researched military history, and I hate to admit, but I hadn't read a novel in I can't remember how long. I read nothing but military history for the most part. And this is the best researched book of history that I have read in years. I've spoken to Rabalais about where he got his material, and I said, "My gosh, he said, "I got it," and I can't remember exactly where he said, but at the Naval Academy Library or somewhere, someplace that was really odd. They had a ton of stuff they had Fox Connor's letters, they had all kind of stuff that they gave to him, and he has done a wonderful job in this book. Now, I'm going to warn you about one thing. It's got a great love story, it's got a lot of stuff on history and war and Eisenhower and all this, but the World War I stuff you have to get through. I love it. I mean, I love the detail that's in this book about World War I, but it's pretty detailed. I mean, if you're looking for just a little light read, this is probably not your book. But if you really want to delve into what World War I was like from our side, it's a classically written book. The research is just out of this world. Let me read a couple of letters. Have I got time, Dave? I want to read a couple. I've told you that vignette about Marshall. In the Eisenhower, Patton, and Marshall home, I've read some of the letters from their children. They said when they were talking about the general, if Marshall, Patton, or Eisenhower were at home or just talking to their family and they mentioned the general, they weren't talking about John Pershing. They were talking about Fox Connor. That was the general in their life. He was the most influential man in their whole life, and they knew it. Let me read a couple of these letters. Pershing considered Connor to have been a brilliant soldier and one of the finest character. This is quotes from him. A brilliant soldier and one of the finest characters our Army has ever produced. He paid tribute to Connor by telling him, "I could have spared any other man in the Allied Expeditionary Force except you." I mean, that's how highly Pershing thought. After the war, it was Connor that briefed Pershing for these congressional hearings. At the very end of the war, we launched several attacks. Literally, the war ended on November the 11th. We launched attacks on November the 10th and the 11th, up till 11 o'clock. And we lost quite a few men, several thousand people, and there were congressional inquiries after the war, and it was Connor that briefed Pershing on his testimony, and Fox, I think, even testified. I'm not sure about that. And also, let me say this, like Churchill, this is a good point, like Churchill, Fox Connor knew, and this is a very illuminating fact, he knew that we had 20 years before we got in another war, and he was right on the money. He knew we were going to fight another war, and that was part of the great thing that he did with Eisenhower, Marshall, and Patton. He kept telling them, just like Winston Churchill did, we had just fought this horrible war that nobody wanted to ever get in another war like that. And of course, he said, well, because of the Treaty of Versailles right after World War I and the draconian measures that they put on Germany, and not requiring them to unconditionally surrender, Connor told them, boys, get ready. You know, you're going to fight another war within 20 years. And it was 20 years exactly to the day when we started World War II in 1938. We didn't here, but they did in Europe, 1938, 39, I think it was, actually. But we started that war just exactly what Connor said we would do. Let me find this right here too. The influence of Connor, this is an excerpt from the book, the influence of Connor upon Eisenhower's career is best described by Eisenhower himself. In sheer ability and character, wrote Eisenhower of Connor, he was the outstanding soldier of my time. Now that's quite an honor to get a letter from Eisenhower, comment by that. Eisenhower believed that Connor, quote, had more influence on me and my outlook than any other individual, especially in regard to the military profession. He paid tribute to his mentor by writing, in a lifetime of association with great and good men. And you imagine how many people Dwight D. Eisenhower, this is a book he wrote after he was President of the United States. He wrote these comments about Fox Connor after, and you can imagine the people he met during his lifetime. He says right here, in a lifetime of association with great and good men, he is the one more or less invisible figure to whom I owe an incalculable debt. He wrote in Crusade in Europe. He was one of the most accomplished soldiers of our time. He wrote a letter to him, and I don't have that letter, I don't think, right here. He gave him a copy of his book, Crusade in Europe, and wrote in there, for Major General Fox Connor, to whom I shall always be indebted. But he wrote a letter on D-Day, right before D-Day. Here he is getting ready for the invasion of Normandy, and here's Eisenhower. Can you imagine the pressure that was on him at that time and all the details that he had to deal with? Who did he write a letter to the day before D-Day? Was Fox Connor. And you ought to read that letter. It's an amazing letter that Eisenhower, he could have written anybody at that time and told people about what he was thinking, but he wrote his mentor, Fox Connor, from Slate Springs, Mississippi, and told him in that letter that he really wished he had him over here. I would love to ask you questions about what I'm about to do here. Now, he couldn't say he was invading Normandy, but I'm sure Connor knew something about it. But he got out of the Army. Connor got out of the Army in 1938, lived to be a pretty ripe old age. He had a lot of health problems, but he and Bug lived out their final lives up at that Adirondack place up in New York, and I think they had a place in New York. But they lived out their lives, had very good children. I think one or two of his children went to West Point, graduated from West Point also. But let me go ahead and stop there. But does anyone have any questions that they would?
Jack, there's a road sign, I believe it's outside of Bruce, that says
There is.
Home of General
Fox Connor, that's right.
I never knew who it was.
Yeah.
But did he live in
Calhoun County, Mississippi is where he grew up. Now, after he got in the Army, he never went back home. They don't ever have any indication that he ever went back to Calhoun County. His mom and dad died, back before war, I guess right after World War I. His mom and dad died. But he never went back to there. He continued to live up in New York. But they do have one of these historical signs, home of Fox Connor, that area there. But he was an amazing guy who applied himself, and he was a serious character now. I mean, he had a fun side to him also. Great marriage, great husband, had a great wife and great kids, and they had and the book goes into that quite a bit, and it's really fascinating about the life they had together. Because when they got to Panama, for instance, their housing was just terrible, and they had to start all over, and they had to fix up Dwight Eisenhower's quarters. But they had by all accounts, a great marriage.
What was Connor's wife's name? I wasn't understanding.
Brandreth, Brandreath. Her first name was Bug. Well, that's what everybody called her. B-U-G. I mean, it was just B-U-G. It was just a nickname. But her was really Elizabeth Brandreth, but everybody called her Bug for some reason. And by all accounts, she was not the most beautiful woman in America, but a fine soul, had a great character to her. And he's a smart man, you're right. I agree. And but he had a great relationship with his wife and his children. And that, as I said, that 47 square mile place is still up in New York. The family still goes up there quite a bit, I think. Yes, sir.
Where did you marry?
They were married in What? Buried in New York, up there at the Adirondack camp. Both of them are buried at that camp up at the Adirondacks in New York State, upstate.
When did he die? Did he live to see the end of World War II?
No, died in 1938. Died in 1938. And no, I'm sorry, Jack. He died after World War II. He retired in 1938. Excuse me. He did see the end of World War II. I can't remember exactly when he died, but it was after World War II. And all these guys, Marshall and Eisenhower and all these fellas, corresponded with him all the time. They didn't have cell phones, obviously, couldn't text, but they wrote a lot.
What if he lived to see Dwight Eisenhower elected president?
I don't think so. I don't think he did. Yes, sir.
This may be an unusual question, but how do you see the current military, the Army, or any of the services in the dynamics of the relationships between commander and lower officer, or like this situation is developed with
Like the mentors?
yeah, mentors?
Well, let me say this, Jim. The Army has a program now. I've got several, believe it or not, this will shock you, but I still have 2 classmates in the Army. And I've been out nearly 50 years. I went in 50 years ago, but I have 2 doctors that are in my class that volunteered at 9/11, and they're still in the Army. They're medical doctors. All the other, line officers like myself are gone.
You
But
tried to get it the Gulf War.
I may have, yeah. That did not pan out too well. Hang on, Mike, let me answer this question. The Army has a mentor program now. I've got one of my classmates named Pat Scully has a son named Sean Scully. Might be a little Irish in there. And Sean and I are real good friends. He's a permanent Revolutionary War professor at West Point. He's a colonel, and he's a permanent professor up there. And he sent me several things about this mentor program. There's another book I failed to bring today on Fox Connor, written by a West Point graduate, whose name escapes me, and it's a small book. Fred Wicker gave it to me, and it's got some great stuff in it. It's not detailed like this book, but it's got some great stuff about Fox Connor, and it's written under the Army Mentor Program, where this guy wrote this book. He's a colonel in the Army, and he wrote it so that other officers could see this is how you mentor somebody. You don't just, tell them what to do. You show them. And this book has got the best description of how, and I'm really failing in this, but of how he took Dwight Eisenhower from a disenamored officer about ready to get out of the Army to literally one of the great commanders of our time. And the way he did it was amazing. He didn't just start telling him what to do. He gave him novels to read to get him interested in the Army, and then went from there, and they worked every day. Yeah, Mike.
Oh, I just looked it up. It was October 1951. He was age 76 and died in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, thank you. I'd forgotten, but he did just,
Jack, I have a step-grandson who's in the first year at the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. Would this book be a good gift to him?
Oh, yeah. Matter of fact, I sent Sean Scully a copy. I got the author. I can call the author, and he'll fill out if you want him to do that, he'll do that for you. He'll dedicate it to whoever you want, and I had him send one to Shawnigan Scully, Colonel Shawnigan Scully, up in West Point. So, Steve Rabalais is a very approachable guy. The problem is Babe's tried to get him up here. I've tried to get him up here. You're taking definitely second best with me. But Rabalais is a practicing attorney, and he's apparently got a very, very active practice. He said, I just can't come up during the week. It takes 3 days. I mean, to come up, do the talk, and leave and get back in there 2 or 3 days, and he just doesn't have it right now. Okay, well, thank you very much. I've enjoyed it.